She booked a lakeside resort cabin with her ex-boyfriend and called it a solo mindfulness retreat. I discovered this completely by accident on a Tuesday morning when Nicole left her tablet open on our kitchen counter while rushing to get ready for her shift at the veterinary clinic. I wasn't snooping through her personal business. I was simply moving the device to plug in my phone charger when the screen automatically lit up, revealing her Gmail inbox with a fresh confirmation email from Serenity Springs Resort sitting right at the top. The booking details were displayed in crisp black text against the white background. Premium lakeside cabin, 2 guests confirmed, check-in Friday at 3 p.m., total cost $847 for the weekend, and most shocking of all, Blake Morrison clearly listed as the second guest on the reservation. My stomach immediately dropped and twisted as I absorbed what I was reading, cross-referencing it with the dates she'd told me about 3 weeks earlier when she first mentioned needing this wellness weekend to center herself and reconnect with her inner peace. She'd been so specific about going alone, making elaborate points about how crucial it was for her personal growth journey to have complete solitude away from all outside influences and distractions. I'd not only supported her decision wholeheartedly but had actually spent an entire evening helping her research different meditation retreat centers online, comparing their programs and philosophies to find the perfect fit for her spiritual needs. The resort she'd actually booked bore no resemblance whatsoever to the modest, monastery-style facility she'd described to me. This was clearly a luxury romantic destination complete with couples massage packages, private hot tubs, wine tastings, and candlelit sunset dinner experiences designed specifically for intimate getaways. When she came bounding down the stairs 15 minutes later in her navy blue veterinary scrubs with her hair pulled back in that messy bun she always wore to work, I calmly held up the tablet screen and asked her directly why Blake Morrison was listed as the second guest on her supposedly solo mindfulness retreat reservation. I watched the color drain completely from her face for exactly 2 or 3 seconds before her expression quickly shifted into what I recognized as her standard damage control mode, the same look she got whenever she had to explain away a mistake at the animal clinic to an upset pet owner. She launched into an immediate explanation about how Blake desperately needed a place to stay that particular weekend because he was currently between apartments and facing some temporary housing issues, and since the lakeside cabin she'd booked happened to have 2 separate beds anyway, it just made perfect practical and financial sense for them to split the cost rather than let one bed go to waste. She insisted she hadn't mentioned Blake's involvement beforehand because she knew with absolute certainty that I would overreact and blow the entire situation completely out of proportion, turning an innocent practical arrangement into some kind of dramatic romantic conspiracy theory. According to Nicole's version of events, I had developed an unfortunate tendency over the past year to become unreasonably jealous and controlling whenever Blake's name came up in conversation, which was completely unfair to both of them since they were simply good friends who happened to share some ancient romantic history from their college days that meant absolutely nothing in the present moment. She seemed genuinely irritated and somewhat offended that I would question her judgment about managing her own adult friendships, repeatedly emphasizing how Blake was currently going through an especially rough emotional and financial patch in his life and truly needed support from people who genuinely cared about his well-being and wanted to help him get back on his feet. The way she presented the entire situation, I was clearly the unreasonable party for having trust issues and making mountains out of molehills, while she was simply being a compassionate friend helping someone in need. She pointed out that Blake had been part of her life long before I came along, and she wasn't about to abandon a friendship just because I felt insecure about their shared past. Nicole reminded me that she'd been completely transparent about her history with Blake when we first started dating 2 years ago, and nothing had ever happened between them since we'd been together, so my current suspicions were both unfounded and frankly insulting to her integrity. She accused me of trying to control who she could spend time with and where she could go, which she considered a major red flag in our relationship that we needed to address before it got worse. According to her perspective, the real problem wasn't her weekend plans with Blake, but rather my inability to trust her judgment and respect her autonomy as an independent adult who didn't need to run every decision past her boyfriend for approval. She grabbed her keys from the counter with visible frustration, checked her watch, and told me she was already running late for work because of this unnecessary drama I'd created over what should have been a simple, straightforward conversation. As she headed toward the garage, she turned back and said that maybe I should spend the weekend. She'd be away doing some serious thinking about whether I wanted to be the kind of partner who supported her friendships and personal growth, or the kind who tried to isolate her from people who mattered to her. Her tone suggested that this entire confrontation was my fault for discovering information she'd deliberately hidden, and that my reaction proved exactly why she'd been right to keep Blake's involvement secret in the first place. The clear message was that I needed to adjust my attitude and expectations, not that she needed to reconsider her choices or communication style. Standing alone in our kitchen after she left, I found myself staring at that tablet screen again, rereading the booking confirmation with growing clarity about what I'd actually discovered. This wasn't just about Blake or the deception, it was about the fundamental disrespect she'd shown for our relationship and my right to know the truth. The fact that she'd crafted such an elaborate cover story and maintained it for 3 weeks demonstrated calculated dishonesty that went far beyond a simple omission. More troubling was her complete lack of remorse when confronted, her immediate pivot to making me the villain for having legitimate concerns about my girlfriend secretly planning a romantic weekend with her ex-boyfriend at a luxury couples resort. The way she'd turned my discovery into proof of my own character flaws rather than acknowledging any wrongdoing revealed something essential about how she viewed our relationship. In her mind, I wasn't a partner deserving of honesty and respect, but rather an obstacle to be managed when necessary to preserve her freedom. Instead of arguing or demanding explanations, I simply looked at her and said sure, using the same dismissive tone she'd perfected whenever my concerns didn't align with her carefully crafted plans for our relationship. That evening when she tried to continue the conversation about my apparent trust issues and controlling behavior patterns, I nodded along thoughtfully and told her she was probably right, that I should definitely work on being more supportive of her friendships and personal growth journey, especially when it came to helping Blake through his difficult transitional period. The genuinely confused look that crossed her face told me she'd expected a much bigger fight, possibly even hoping for some dramatic confrontation that would justify her decision to deceive me and make me look like the unreasonable partner she'd already described to Blake. But I'd already made my decision about what came next, and it didn't involve giving her any more ammunition to use against me in whatever narrative she was constructing. I went to bed early that night while she stayed up late texting someone, most likely Blake based on the frequency and urgency of her responses, and I woke up at 5:30 the next morning while she was still sleeping soundly beside me, completely unaware that this would be the last time we'd ever share the same physical space or wake up in the same bed together. I dressed quietly in my standard park ranger uniform and made coffee exactly like any other ordinary Wednesday morning, then sat at our kitchen table with my laptop and methodically began executing a detailed plan I'd spent the long sleepless hours forming while staring at the ceiling and listening to her peaceful breathing. First, I logged into all of our shared online accounts and carefully documented every single monthly expense, every recurring bill, every financial obligation tied to our townhouse rental agreement so I could understand exactly what she'd be facing once I was no longer contributing my substantial share to our combined household budget. The lease was in my name since my credit score was significantly better than hers, and my park service salary covered roughly 70% of our monthly housing costs, utilities, internet service, and shared expenses like groceries and the premium streaming subscriptions she'd insisted were absolutely necessary for her relaxation after stressful days at the veterinary clinic. I transferred my portion of next month's rent directly to her checking account along with an additional $500 in cash, enough to cover her immediate expenses while she figured out her next steps and made alternative arrangements, because despite everything that had happened between us, I didn't want to leave her completely stranded financially without any warning or transition period. After finishing the financial logistics, I spent the next 3 hours methodically and systematically packing my belongings into cardboard boxes I'd retrieved from my truck, loading everything through our back door and into my pickup using the narrow alley behind our townhouse complex to completely avoid the security cameras mounted strategically near the main front entrance that recorded everyone's comings and goings. Everything I'd accumulated over our 2 years together fit surprisingly easily into the back of my truck, my extensive camping gear, professional photography equipment, personal book collection, clothing, hiking boots, and the few pieces of furniture I'd originally brought from my previous apartment when we decided to move in together. I worked efficiently and quietly, taking only what was definitively and unquestionably mine and carefully leaving behind anything we'd purchased together as a couple, including the expensive espresso machine she'd insisted we absolutely needed for proper morning coffee and the large smart television we'd bought specifically for cozy movie nights that had gradually become increasingly rare as she spent more and more time absorbed in her phone and social media accounts. The most emotionally difficult part was packing away all the framed photographs from our hiking adventures and weekend camping trips, images that now felt like documentation of a relationship that had apparently been slowly dissolving and deteriorating without me fully realizing the extent of the damage until this moment of brutal clarity. By 9:15 that morning, my truck was completely loaded and our townhouse looked exactly as it had when I'd first moved in 2 years earlier, minus any trace of my presence or contribution to the life we'd supposedly been building together as partners working toward shared goals and dreams. I left my house key on the kitchen counter next to a brief handwritten note that said simply avoiding any overreaction, echoing her exact condescending words from the morning before back to her in a way that would make my meaning absolutely crystal clear without requiring any lengthy explanations or emotional confrontations. I didn't provide any forwarding address or contact information, didn't explain where I was planning to go or what my next steps would be, because after 2 years together and countless conversations about communication, trust, and mutual respect, she'd shown me exactly how much my feelings and legitimate concerns actually mattered to her when they conflicted with her personal desires. As I drove away from our neighborhood for the final time, I felt an unexpected sense of relief washing over me rather than the devastation and heartbreak I'd anticipated, as if I'd finally stopped carrying a heavy weight I hadn't even realized was slowly crushing my spirit and self-respect over the course of our relationship. The decision to leave without drama or lengthy explanations felt completely right, a clean break that matched exactly the level of consideration she'd shown me when planning her romantic weekend getaway with Blake while pretending it was a solo spiritual retreat for her personal development and inner peace. I realized that her ability to lie so effortlessly and maintain that deception for weeks while looking me in the eye every single day revealed a fundamental disconnect between who I'd thought she was and who she actually turned out to be. Nicole returned home from her veterinary clinic shift that evening to find an empty townhouse and immediately began sending me increasingly desperate messages that progressed through a completely predictable cycle of emotions, starting with genuine confusion about my whereabouts and quickly escalating through anger, blame, manipulation tactics, and finally what appeared to be genuine panic as the full reality of her financial and social situation began to sink in with devastating clarity. Her first text came at exactly 6:47, just 3 simple words asking "Where are you?" followed 20 minutes later by a much longer message demanding to know why all my belongings were mysteriously gone and whether this was some kind of elaborate joke or punishment specifically designed to hurt her over the Blake situation that she'd already explained was completely innocent. When I didn't respond within her expected timeframe, her tone shifted dramatically and predictably from confused and concerned to accusatory and hostile, with multiple messages claiming I was being childish, manipulative, and emotionally abusive by disappearing without any explanation instead of staying to have an adult conversation about our relationship problems like mature, committed people should when facing challenges together. By 10:30 that night, she was sending paragraph-long texts that alternated wildly between fury and desperation, calling me selfish and cowardly for abandoning her without warning during what she described as a difficult time in her life, then immediately following up with pleading messages begging me to come back home so we could work through our issues together and rebuild the trust that had somehow been damaged. Throughout this entire digital meltdown that continued for 3 solid days, I maintained complete and absolute radio silence, not responding to a single message or acknowledging any of her numerous attempts to contact me through phone calls, text messages, social media platforms, email, or even voice messages left through mutual friends who she'd enlisted to help track me down. I'd made the conscious and deliberate decision that after 2 years of repeatedly trying to communicate my needs, concerns, and boundaries only to have them consistently dismissed, minimized, or turned against me as evidence of my own character flaws, there was simply nothing left to say that would make any meaningful difference in how she viewed our relationship or my place within it. Over the next several days, Our extensive network of mutual friends began reaching out with increasingly pointed questions about what had actually happened between Nicole and me, clearly having heard some carefully crafted version of events from her that painted me as the unreasonable villain who'd mysteriously vanished without any explanation after what she characterized as a minor disagreement about her social life and personal friendships. When people asked me directly what had caused our sudden breakup, I kept my response consistently simple and factual, directing them to ask Nicole specifically about the lakeside cabin booking details with Blake if they wanted to understand the complete story, then letting the documented facts speak for themselves without adding my own emotional interpretation or defensive commentary that might muddy the waters. This straightforward approach proved remarkably effective because most of our friends already knew Blake's questionable reputation and problematic history with relationships, and when they pressed Nicole for specific details about the retreat situation and Blake's involvement, her increasingly defensive responses and obvious discomfort with their direct questions told them everything they needed to know about who was actually telling the truth and who was attempting to control the narrative. The social fallout was swift, decisive, and frankly more dramatic than I'd anticipated, with our previously cohesive friend group naturally dividing along surprisingly clear lines based primarily on people's fundamental values regarding honesty, loyalty, and accountability in romantic relationships. Those who genuinely valued integrity and straightforward communication in their own lives gravitated toward supporting my decision to leave rather than engage in endless cycles of argument and manipulation, while those who seemed to thrive on drama and relationship chaos appeared more sympathetic to Nicole's carefully constructed version of events where she was the innocent victim of my sudden, cruel, and completely unprovoked abandonment. My closest friends from the Park Service, people who'd known me for years and truly understood my character and values, immediately saw through Nicole's transparent attempts to rewrite history and offered their unwavering support without requiring detailed explanations or justifications for my choices and actions. The most revealing and telling moment came when Nicole's older sister Amanda called me directly, initially planning to deliver what sounded like a carefully prepared speech about how badly I'd treated Nicole and damaged her emotionally by leaving without warning during such a supposedly vulnerable time in her life when she needed stability and support. However, when I calmly and methodically explained the actual sequence of events, including Nicole's deliberate deception about Blake's involvement in the retreat, the elaborate cover story she'd maintained consistently for weeks, her dismissive attitude when confronted with concrete evidence, and her complete refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing or show genuine remorse for her choices, Amanda's tone shifted dramatically as she began to realize that Nicole's version had been heavily sanitized, manipulated, and edited to remove any details that might make her look bad. Amanda admitted with obvious embarrassment that Nicole had portrayed the entire situation as me suddenly becoming irrationally jealous and controlling over her completely innocent friendship with Blake, conveniently omitting all the crucial details about the romantic resort booking, the weeks of calculated lying, and her contemptuous reaction when caught red-handed in the deception. By the end of our conversation, Amanda was genuinely apologizing for jumping to conclusions and expressing serious concern about what she was recognizing as Nicole's pattern of manipulating situations to avoid accountability for her choices and consequences. Over the following weeks, more details began emerging about Blake's true character and the real circumstances behind his sudden reappearance in Nicole's life, painting a picture that was far more disturbing and calculated than even I had initially suspected when I first discovered their secret weekend plans together. According to mutual friends who'd stayed in contact with both of us, Blake was currently unemployed and had been for several months after being terminated from his previous marketing job for what were described as inappropriate workplace relationships and questionable expense account practices that had made him essentially unhireable in their industry. Rather than finding legitimate work or taking responsibility for his professional reputation, Blake had apparently developed a pattern of reconnecting with former girlfriends during their vulnerable moments, using his charm and manipulation skills to secure free accommodation, meals, and financial support while presenting himself as a temporarily struggling entrepreneur with big plans just around the corner. Nicole had been specifically targeted because Blake knew from social media that she was in a stable relationship with someone who had steady income, which made her an ideal mark for his particular brand of emotional and financial exploitation. The expensive lakeside resort weekend that had triggered my discovery was never intended as a romantic rekindling between Blake and Nicole, but rather as Blake's way of securing free luxury accommodations that he could never afford on his own while simultaneously testing Nicole's willingness to deceive her boyfriend and prioritize Blake's needs over her committed relationship. When Nicole returned from that disastrous weekend to find me completely gone from her life, she faced immediate financial strain since the townhouse lease had been entirely in my name and her veterinary technician salary alone couldn't even begin to cover the monthly expenses that my income had been subsidizing for the past 2 years. Blake, demonstrating his true opportunistic nature, immediately recognized Nicole's desperate situation as a perfect opening to manipulate his way into staying at her place temporarily, promising to help with expenses while he got back on his feet financially and professionally. What Nicole didn't realize until it was far too late was that Blake had no intention of contributing anything meaningful to her household expenses or helping her maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to during our relationship. Instead, he moved in with nothing but a single duffel bag and immediately began treating her townhouse like his personal bachelor pad, inviting friends over for loud parties, leaving messes for her to clean up, eating her food, and using her car without permission while making grandiose promises about job interviews and business opportunities that never seemed to materialize into actual income or stability. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Blake's presence began negatively affecting Nicole's professional reputation at the veterinary clinic where she'd worked hard to establish herself as reliable and competent. Her colleagues and supervisors started noticing that she was frequently distracted, often late to work, and sometimes arrived looking like she hadn't slept properly, clearly dealing with significant stress and relationship drama that was affecting her job performance and patient care. The breaking point came when Blake showed up at the clinic one afternoon, visibly intoxicated and belligerent, demanding money from Nicole in front of her coworkers and several clients who were waiting with their pets for appointments. He caused such a disruptive scene in the parking lot, shouting about Nicole owing him support and accusing her of being ungrateful for everything he'd done for her, that the clinic manager had to intervene and threatened to call security to remove him from the premises. The embarrassing incident was witnessed by multiple colleagues and clients, damaging Nicole's professional reputation and creating awkward conversations with her supervisor about whether her personal problems were affecting her ability to maintain the clinic's standards of professionalism and client service. Word spread quickly through their small professional community about the parking lot confrontation, and several longtime clients specifically requested to work with other veterinary technicians rather than deal with Nicole, who was now seen as someone whose chaotic personal life might interfere with proper pet care. Blake's manipulation extended beyond just financial exploitation to deliberate psychological abuse, constantly undermining Nicole's confidence and making her question her own judgment and worth, using classic manipulation techniques like gaslighting, emotional blackmail, and threats to abandon her just when she needed support the most during this incredibly difficult transition period. He would alternate between moments of fake charm and affection when he needed something from her, followed by periods of cold indifference or outright cruelty when she failed to meet his ever-changing expectations and demands for attention, money, or services. Nicole found herself walking on eggshells in her own home, constantly trying to anticipate Blake's moods and needs while sacrificing her own comfort, financial security, and emotional well-being to keep him satisfied enough to stay, because the alternative of being completely alone with all the expenses seemed even more terrifying than dealing with his increasingly erratic and demanding behavior. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me when mutual friends shared these updates. Nicole had destroyed our stable, honest relationship because she felt I was too controlling and predictable, only to end up trapped with someone who was actually controlling her every move while contributing absolutely nothing positive to her life or future prospects. Blake had successfully isolated her from most of her support network through his manipulative tactics, making her feel like she couldn't reach out to friends or family for help because she was too ashamed to admit how badly she'd misjudged the situation and destroyed her previous stable relationship for someone who turned out to be a complete fraud. Meanwhile, her financial situation continued deteriorating as Blake's promises of finding work or contributing to household expenses proved to be complete fabrications designed to buy him more time to exploit her resources and hospitality. He was spending her money on alcohol, takeout food, and what appeared to be gambling or other questionable activities, while Nicole struggled to cover basic necessities like rent, utilities, groceries, and her car payment on her reduced income. The stress of supporting two people on a salary that had barely covered her portion of expenses when we were sharing costs began showing in her appearance and behavior, with friends noting that she'd lost significant weight, seemed constantly anxious and exhausted, and had developed nervous habits like constantly checking her phone and looking over her shoulder as if expecting confrontation or bad news. Her work performance continued declining as the situation at home became more chaotic and unpredictable, with Blake's demands for attention and money interrupting her professional responsibilities and making it impossible for her to focus properly on patient care or maintain the level of competence and reliability that had previously characterized her career. The veterinary clinic where she worked began documenting performance issues and attendance problems, creating a paper trail that could potentially lead to her termination if the pattern continued, which would leave her completely unable to support Blake's lifestyle or even maintain basic housing and transportation for herself. Several of her colleagues privately expressed concern about the dramatic changes in her personality and work habits, but Nicole had become so defensive about her relationship choices that she interpreted their genuine worry as criticism, further isolating herself from potential sources of support that might have helped her recognize the toxic situation she'd created. 2 months after I'd left the townhouse and moved to my new apartment across town, Nicole managed to track me down at the rock climbing gym where I'd started spending my evenings, having apparently learned about my new routine through persistent questioning of mutual friends who were still in contact with both of us. I was finishing my usual Wednesday workout, feeling strong and clear-headed after an hour of challenging routes that had become part of my new healthy lifestyle, when I spotted her sitting in her car in the parking lot, clearly waiting for me to emerge from the building. She looked significantly different from the confident, well-groomed woman I'd lived with for 2 years, noticeably thinner, with dark circles under her eyes and an overall appearance of someone who hadn't been sleeping or eating properly for weeks, wearing clothes that seemed too large for her diminished frame. When I walked toward my motorcycle, she quickly got out of her car and approached me with an expression that combined desperation with forced determination, clearly having rehearsed whatever speech she was planning to deliver. She began by acknowledging that Blake had turned out to be manipulative and dishonest, admitting that he'd been using her for free accommodation and financial support while contributing nothing meaningful to their living situation or her emotional well-being. Nicole explained that she'd finally asked him to leave after the embarrassing incident at her workplace, though she was careful to frame this as her taking control of the situation rather than admitting that she'd been completely taken advantage of by someone whose character I'd probably recognized from the very beginning. She insisted that her weekend with Blake had been purely platonic, that nothing romantic or physical had happened between them, and that she'd never intended to hurt me or damage our relationship through her deception about the retreat arrangements. According to Nicole, Blake had manipulated her into keeping his involvement secret by convincing her that I would react irrationally and jealously, playing on her fears about my supposed controlling tendencies to justify the elaborate lies she'd maintained for weeks. She begged me to reconsider our breakup, claiming it had been just one mistake born of confusion and poor judgment rather than a fundamental character flaw or lack of respect for our relationship. Nicole promised that she'd learned valuable lessons about trust, communication, and the importance of prioritizing our relationship over outside influences, and she suggested we could attend couples counseling together to rebuild what we'd once had and address any underlying issues that had contributed to her poor decision-making process. When I calmly refused her request and explained that her lie and subsequent contemptuous dismissal of my legitimate concerns had permanently shattered the foundation of trust that any healthy relationship required, she became visibly frustrated and angry, accusing me of being cold, unforgiving, and unreasonably stubborn about holding grudges over past mistakes. She pointed out that everyone makes errors in judgment, especially when being manipulated by someone as skilled as Blake, and that my unwillingness to even consider reconciliation proved that I'd never truly loved her the way she thought I had during our 2 years together. Nicole claimed that a man who genuinely cared about her would be willing to work through difficulties and give her a second chance to prove that she could be the partner I deserved, rather than simply walking away at the first sign of trouble or conflict in our relationship. Her tone became increasingly desperate as she realized that her carefully planned appeal wasn't having the intended effect, and she began making promises about how different things would be if I gave her another opportunity to show her commitment to honesty and transparency. She assured me that she would cut all contact with Blake permanently, would be completely open about her friendships and social activities, and would prioritize our relationship above all other considerations to prove that she'd learned from her mistakes and grown as a person through this difficult experience. When none of her arguments seemed to move me toward reconsideration, Nicole's desperation shifted into anger and resentment, with accusations that I was being emotionally detached and punishing her excessively for what she continued to characterize as a single lapse in judgment rather than a pattern of deception and disrespect. I listened to her entire speech with calm detachment, feeling neither anger nor sadness but rather a clear confirmation that I'd made the right decision in leaving when I did, before our relationship could deteriorate further or cause additional emotional damage to both of us. When she finally finished talking, I wished her well sincerely, told her I hoped she found the happiness and stability she was looking for, then walked to my motorcycle and drove away peacefully, leaving her standing alone in the parking lot with the realization that her former life and the security it had provided were truly gone forever. As I rode through the quiet streets toward my new apartment, I reflected on how completely different this confrontation had felt compared to our final argument 2 months earlier in the townhouse kitchen. Back then, I'd been hurt, confused, and emotionally invested in trying to salvage what I'd thought was a relationship worth fighting for, but now I felt only a calm detachment and clarity about the choices we'd both made and their inevitable consequences. Nicole's desperate attempt to rewrite history and minimize her actions had actually confirmed that she still didn't understand the fundamental issue wasn't about Blake specifically, but about her willingness to deceive me and then dismiss my concerns when confronted with evidence of her dishonesty. Her promises about cutting contact with Blake and being more transparent in the future rang hollow because they addressed the symptoms rather than the underlying problem of her lack of respect for me and our relationship. The fact that she'd characterized her elaborate deception as just one mistake showed that she still didn't grasp how her behavior had revealed something essential about her character and values that couldn't be fixed with counseling or good intentions. I realized that even if she kept every promise she'd made in that parking lot, I would never be able to trust her completely again, and a relationship without genuine trust was just an elaborate performance that would eventually exhaust both of us. More importantly, my time alone had shown me what it felt like to live without constantly worrying about someone else's moods, demands, or hidden agendas, and I discovered a peace and self-respect that I wasn't willing to sacrifice for the illusion of getting back what we'd supposedly had together. The new motorcycle I'd bought with money I was no longer spending on someone else's lifestyle choices felt like a perfect symbol of the freedom and autonomy I'd reclaimed, representing my ability to make decisions based solely on what was best for my own well-being and future happiness. 8 months after our final breakup, I encountered Nicole completely by chance at the Saturday farmers market in our old neighborhood, where I'd returned to visit my favorite vendor who sold locally sourced honey that I'd been buying for years before moving across town to start my new life. The contrast between us was immediately striking and told the entire story of how differently our lives had progressed since that morning I'd quietly packed my belongings and disappeared from the townhouse we'd once shared together. I had recently received a promotion to lead park ranger position that came with a substantial salary increase and additional responsibilities managing a team of junior rangers, and I was actively making plans to relocate to a national park in Montana where I'd accepted a dream position that would start the following spring. Just the week before, I'd closed on purchasing a small cabin with mountain views about an hour outside the city, a place that represented everything I'd wanted but could never afford while supporting someone else's expensive lifestyle and unrealistic expectations about luxury accommodations. I was wearing new hiking gear and looked healthy, confident, and genuinely content with the direction my life had taken since choosing to prioritize my own goals and happiness over trying to maintain a relationship with someone who didn't value honesty or commitment. Nicole, on the other hand, appeared to be struggling significantly with both her financial situation and overall well-being, looking even thinner and more worn down than she had during our confrontation at the climbing gym several months earlier. She was dressed in clothes that had clearly seen better days, her hair was shorter and less carefully styled than I remembered, and she carried herself with the defeated posture of someone whose life hadn't turned out anything like she'd planned or expected when she made her fateful decision to choose Blake over our stable relationship. When our eyes met across the crowded market, I saw a flash of recognition followed immediately by what appeared to be shame and regret, but I simply nodded politely and continued browsing the honey selection, having no desire to initiate conversation or create any kind of dramatic scene in such a public setting. However, Nicole approached me anyway, clearly having gathered her courage to attempt one final conversation about what had happened between us and perhaps hoping for some kind of closure or forgiveness that might help her feel better about the choices she'd made. She began by asking how I was doing, commenting on how good I looked, and mentioning that she'd heard through mutual friends about my promotion and upcoming move to Montana, trying to keep the tone light and casual as if we were simply old acquaintances catching up after losing touch naturally over time. When I responded politely but briefly, maintaining appropriate boundaries without being unnecessarily cold or hostile, she seemed to interpret this as permission to continue talking and began sharing details about her current living situation that painted a picture of significant decline and instability. Nicole revealed that she was now working part-time at a pet grooming salon, a substantial step down from her previous full-time veterinary technician position, and was living back with her parents in their small apartment after being unable to maintain the townhouse or find affordable housing that she could manage on her reduced income alone. The most shocking revelation came when she hesitantly admitted that Blake had not only drained her savings account through various schemes and manipulative requests for money, but had also convinced her to invest in what turned out to be a completely fraudulent cryptocurrency operation that had cost her nearly $8,000 of her carefully saved emergency fund. Even more disturbing, she revealed with obvious embarrassment and pain that she'd discovered Blake had been secretly filming their intimate moments together without her knowledge or consent, sharing these private recordings with his friends as some kind of twisted trophy or proof of his conquest, which had only come to light when one of his acquaintances had contacted her months later to warn her about the violation of her privacy and dignity. This final betrayal had apparently been the catalyst that finally opened her eyes to Blake's true character and motivated her to end their toxic relationship permanently, though by that point the damage to her finances, career, and emotional well-being had already been devastated beyond easy repair. As she shared these painful details, Nicole's voice became increasingly shaky and emotional, and I could see that she was struggling not to break down completely in the middle of the busy farmers' market surrounded by other shoppers going about their normal weekend routines. She made one last desperate plea for us to consider trying again, explaining that she now truly understood what she'd lost when she chose to prioritize Blake's temporary excitement over our stable, honest partnership, and that she'd learned through painful experience to value the qualities of loyalty, reliability, and genuine care that I'd offered her throughout our relationship. Nicole insisted that she was a completely different person now, someone who had been humbled by hardship and would never again take for granted the security and respect that came from being with someone who truly cared about her well-being and future happiness. When I gently but firmly explained that our relationship had died the moment she chose deception over honesty and dismissed my legitimate concerns as overreactions rather than valid feelings that deserved consideration and respect, she began crying softly, finally understanding that there would be no reconciliation or second chance for us to rebuild what had been permanently broken by her choices and their consequences. Through her tears, Nicole acknowledged that she'd thrown away the best relationship she'd ever had for someone who had never cared about her as anything more than a convenient source of free accommodation and financial support, admitting that every single thing I'd probably suspected about Blake's character and motivations had turned out to be completely accurate. She confessed that even during that infamous weekend at the lakeside resort, Blake had spent most of his time on his phone texting other women and making plans for his next conquest, treating her more like a roommate who was paying for his vacation than a romantic partner worthy of attention and affection. The expensive couple's massage and romantic dinner packages that she'd presumably been looking forward to had been completely ignored by Blake, who preferred to spend the time drinking heavily at the resort bar and flirting openly with other female guests while Nicole sat alone in their cabin wondering what she'd actually gotten herself into by destroying our relationship for this selfish, immature person. Nicole revealed that she'd spent most of that weekend feeling increasingly uncomfortable and regretful about her decision, especially when Blake made crude comments about how easy it had been to manipulate her into paying for the entire trip and lying to her boyfriend about his involvement. According to her account, Blake had actually bragged to her about his ability to identify women in stable relationships who could be convinced to betray their partners for the thrill of something new and exciting, describing it as a skill he'd perfected over years of targeting emotionally vulnerable people. The realization that she'd been nothing more than another mark in Blake's elaborate con game had been devastating to her self-esteem and sense of judgment, but by then the damage to our relationship was already irreversible and there was no way to undo the lies and deception that had led to that moment. She admitted that she'd known deep down that Blake was using her even during those first few weeks after I'd left, but she'd been too ashamed and prideful to reach out to me for help or admit that she'd made a terrible mistake in choosing him over the stable, loving partnership we'd built together over 2 years of shared experiences and mutual support. The financial exploitation had escalated gradually, with Blake starting with small requests for loan that he promised to repay quickly, then progressing to larger amounts for supposed emergencies and business opportunities that never materialized into actual income or returns on her investment in his various schemes. By the time she realized that Blake had no intention of ever contributing financially to their household or relationship, she was already in too deep financially to easily extract herself from the situation, especially after he'd convinced her to put his name on several of her credit card accounts and bank statements. The cryptocurrency scam had been Blake's final and most devastating manipulation, presented as a guaranteed investment opportunity that would make both of them wealthy enough to travel the world and live the luxury lifestyle that Nicole had always dreamed about but could never afford on her veterinary technician salary alone. Blake had shown her fake documents and testimonials from supposed previous investors who had supposedly made enormous profits through his insider connections and market knowledge, convincing her to liquidate her entire emergency fund and even borrow additional money against her credit cards to maximize their potential returns. When the inevitable collapse came and Nicole realized she'd been completely swindled, Blake had simply disappeared before returning with a story about how they'd both been victims of a sophisticated scam, deflecting responsibility while making her feel grateful he was willing to stay and work through the crisis together. I walked away from that final encounter at the farmer's market with a profound sense of absolute serenity and closure that I hadn't expected to feel, surprised by the complete absence of the protective instinct and emotional connection that had once made Nicole's pain feel like my own responsibility to fix or alleviate through comfort and support. For the first time since our relationship had ended, I felt truly free from any lingering sense of obligation or concern for her well-being, not because I wished her harm, but because I'd finally accepted that her choices and their consequences belonged entirely to her and were no longer connected to my life or future happiness in any meaningful way. The contrast between her current situation and the thriving life I'd built since leaving had been more dramatic than I could have imagined, serving as clear evidence that my decision to walk away without attempting to salvage our damaged relationship had been absolutely the right choice for both of us. Instead of dwelling on Nicole's obvious pain and regret or feeling guilty about my own success and contentment, I focused entirely on the exciting plans ahead of me, particularly my upcoming transfer to Glacier National Park, where I would be starting as a senior park ranger in one of the most beautiful and pristine wilderness areas in the entire country. The new position represented everything I'd worked toward throughout my career, combining my passion for conservation, outdoor recreation, and environmental education with substantial advancement opportunities and the kind of meaningful work that would make a lasting difference in preserving natural resources for future generations to enjoy and appreciate. My recently purchased cabin, situated on 5 acres of wooded land with unobstructed mountain views and complete privacy from neighbors, had become my sanctuary and symbol of the independence and self-reliance I discovered during my months of living alone without someone else's constant demands and expectations weighing down every decision. The mortgage payments were easily manageable on my increased salary, and I'd already begun planning improvements and additions that would make the property even more comfortable and functional for the quiet, purposeful lifestyle I'd come to prefer over the social obligations and relationship drama that had once consumed so much of my time and energy. Every evening after work, I would sit on my back porch with coffee or a beer, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple while planning weekend hiking trips, photography expeditions, and camping adventures that I could pursue according to my own schedule and interests without needing to negotiate or compromise with someone whose priorities and values were fundamentally different from my own. The motorcycle had become my primary means of transportation for both commuting and recreational riding, representing not just practical efficiency but also the freedom to make spontaneous decisions about where to go and what to explore based purely on my own curiosity and desire for adventure rather than someone else's comfort level or financial concerns. Friends from the Park Service had commented repeatedly on how much happier and more confident I seemed compared to the stressed, walking on eggshells version of myself I'd become during the final months of my relationship with Nicole, when I'd been constantly trying to balance her increasing demands and mood swings with my own professional responsibilities and personal goals. The clarity I'd gained about my own values and priorities had made it easier to recognize and appreciate the people in my life who genuinely supported my growth and happiness, while also helping me establish healthier boundaries with those who sought to drain my energy or manipulate my emotions for their own benefit. I realized that Nicole's attempt to manage and minimize me, to make me feel like I should be grateful for her attention while simultaneously taking for granted everything I provided in terms of stability, financial support, and emotional investment, had actually revealed my own strength and worth in ways that I might never have discovered if she hadn't forced me to choose between maintaining my self-respect and preserving a relationship that was slowly eroding my confidence and sense of identity. The months of living independently had taught me that I didn't need someone else's validation or companionship to feel complete and fulfilled, though I remained open to the possibility of eventually finding a partner who would genuinely appreciate and reciprocate the care, loyalty, and commitment I had to offer without trying to exploit those qualities for personal gain. As I drove my motorcycle toward home after that final conversation with Nicole, I felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point of clarity and self-awareness, understanding that sometimes the greatest act of self-love and respect is simply having the courage and wisdom to walk away from someone who doesn't recognize or value what you bring to their life. The road ahead stretched out before me, both literally and metaphorically, representing endless possibilities for growth, adventure, and meaningful connections with people who shared my values and appreciated the qualities that Nicole had taken for granted or actively dismissed as boring and predictable. My transfer to Montana would mark not just a career advancement but a complete geographical and emotional fresh start, an opportunity to build relationships with colleagues and community members who valued integrity, hard work, and genuine commitment rather than superficial excitement and material possessions. The irony wasn't lost on me that Nicole's rejection of my supposedly controlling and suffocating nature had actually freed me to become the most authentic and confident version of myself I'd ever been, someone who could make decisions based purely on personal values and long-term goals rather than constantly trying to accommodate someone else's whims and manipulations. I'd learned through painful experience that real love and partnership required mutual respect, honest communication, and shared commitment to each other's growth and happiness, qualities that couldn't be faked or forced through counseling or promises to change fundamental character traits. The life I was building in Montana would be exactly what I wanted it to be, filled with meaningful work protecting wilderness areas, outdoor adventures that challenged and inspired me, and the peace that came from knowing that every choice I made was aligned with my authentic self rather than filtered through someone else's expectations or criticisms. Looking back on our relationship now, I could see clearly how Nicole's constant dissatisfaction and need for drama and excitement had gradually worn down my natural optimism and enthusiasm, making me question my own judgment and worth in ways that had taken months of solitude and reflection to fully understand and overcome. The financial freedom I'd gained by no longer supporting her lifestyle had allowed me to invest in things that genuinely enhanced my life, from the cabin to the motorcycle that represented my newfound independence. Most importantly, I discovered that being alone was fundamentally different from being lonely, and that the right person would come into my life when I was living authentically rather than trying to fix someone who didn't want genuine partnership. The future felt bright and full of potential in ways it hadn't during those final months with Nicole, when every conversation had felt like walking through a minefield and every plan had been subject to her changing approval. As the mountain sunset painted the sky ahead of me, I realized that this ending was actually the beginning of everything I was meant to become. My closest friends from the Park Service, People who'd known me for years and understood my character immediately saw through Nicole's attempts to rewrite history and offered their support without requiring detailed explanations or justifications for my choices. The most telling moment came when Nicole's older sister Amanda called me directly, initially planning to deliver what sounded like a prepared speech about how badly I'd treated Nicole and damaged her emotionally by leaving without warning during such a vulnerable time in her life. However, when I calmly explained the actual sequence of events, including Nicole's deliberate deception about Blake, the elaborate cover story she'd maintained for weeks, and her complete dismissal of my legitimate concerns when confronted with evidence, Amanda's tone shifted dramatically as she began to realize that Nicole's version had been heavily sanitized and manipulated. Amanda admitted that Nicole had portrayed the situation as me suddenly becoming jealous and controlling over her innocent friendship with Blake, conveniently omitting the crucial details about the romantic resort booking, the weeks of lying, and her contemptuous reaction when caught in the deception. By the end of our conversation, Amanda was apologizing for jumping to conclusions and expressing genuine concern about Nicole's pattern of manipulating situations to avoid accountability for her choices and their consequences. By 9:15, my truck was completely loaded and the townhouse looked exactly as it had when I'd first moved in, minus any trace of my presence or contribution to the life we'd supposedly been building together. I left my house key on the kitchen counter next to a brief handwritten note that said simply, "Avoiding any overreaction," echoing her exact words from the morning before back to her in a way that would make my meaning crystal clear. I didn't explain where I was going or provide any contact information, because after 2 years together and countless conversations about communication and trust, she'd shown me exactly how much my feelings and concerns actually mattered to her.